we are in terms of reducing our emissions and how much that is attributable to the carbon tax.
Thanks for the question. Again, I'll start and then turn to Derek to provide additional detail. But, it's probably worth starting with saying what we actually have provided so far and maybe try to clarify a few things that came up in the earlier rounds of questioning. So what we've done so far has been to provide all the assumptions that drive the two reference cases, the one reference case with the existing with measures and one with the additional measures. And we've given a complete list of all the federal activities and provincial activities that lead to those two different reference cases, which you'll recall from the OPQ or REF22 and REF22A. And so we provided that and the numbers associated with that. To be honest with you, the model itself, the model is actually, it's the code, it's the software language, it's a data set, and as I think we noted, it's 280,000 variables. It wouldn't really be a matter of posting a model on a website. You'd have to post a computer on a website because the model is really ultimately all of these things working together.
We'll have to stop there, but
come up with the modeling outcome.
Yeah, but we're at 6 minutes. Yeah. But basically what you're saying, Mr. Hansen, is a model, in the old days when you had printouts, computer printouts with lines and lines of code, well, the model would be a bunch of printouts with lines and lines of code, I guess.
Derek, may you explain it better than I'm capable of?
Well, the code would actually be in the model, in the computer, right?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Just is the time up? Just if you're going to cut our
the
time's
time up. It was
down.
We weren't even we were over time.
Yeah, I'm just in the second rounds. You often cut our time down, and I'm just wondering if we can try and avoid that happening.
Oh yeah, no, that's for sure. Yeah,
Thanks.
That was my plan to go the full thing. Yeah. Yeah, so, but basically it's code, and you can print out the code, and you can print out the formulas. But then I don't want to take up too much time on this. I was, yes.
Mr. Chair, can you ask the witnesses if it's possible for the model to have a web interface?
I don't even know what that means, but...
Could you connect it to the internet so that everyone can see it instead of...
Can you have a web interface?
It's
okay, that answers the question.
Custom made for us.
Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Van Koeverden. Okay, Mr. Van Koeverden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the officials being here with us today. Mr. Moffat, I think the committee would benefit from clarification on one issue. I think we would like to know whether that 3% reduction referenced in an earlier answer was did it take into consideration the hypothetical alternative to the curve that we saw? Because prior to 2015, we were on an accelerating upward trajectory with respect to our emissions. Since that has been turned around, and so the 3% reduction in emissions that was referenced and then characterized as a 1% allocation from carbon pricing seemed to be a little bit misleading from my perspective. Although I recognize there was a lot of back and forth throughout that question. So could that be clarified, please?
I'll start and again turn to Derek. But the number that was discussed, the 3%, I assume is with reference to an absolute a statement about Canada's absolute emissions relative to a previous year. So that of course that doesn't take into account avoided emissions. In other words, what the emissions would have been, and emissions, as we know, have grown steadily and increasingly for decades until the introduction of carbon pricing and complementary measures, which then, so for a fair kind of attribution of the impact of carbon pricing, one needs to account for not just where we are today, but all of the emissions that have been avoided as a result of those measures. So thanks for the question.
And what was the population of Canada approximately in the year that we're attributing this 3% reduction from? Or what was the year? And I can just look it up because I think it's relevant. When I look at the curve and the change in trajectory that we've seen in the past 6 to 8 years with respect to our emissions profile, notwithstanding the fact that our population has grown quite significantly since the mid-90s. See, there are two things that I meant to ask my question prior to being a little bit thrown off by the previous answer. One, it seems as though this committee has been hung up on two things with respect to carbon pricing: the effectiveness of carbon pricing to lower emissions, and the ability of the Canada Carbon Rebate to make 8 out of 10 families whole or more than whole with respect to the cost of the carbon price. Now, there's 300 economists, more than that actually now, that have signed on to a letter referencing 5 or 6 key points that have been frankly misleading Canadians over the past couple of months with the Conservatives' campaign against carbon pricing. I'm curious to know if you're aware of any economists out there in the ecosystem that have joined a joint letter to the contrary, because quite frankly, I've looked for them. I've looked for evidence to the contrary, and it doesn't seem like there's a consortium or even, you know, a small group of economists who are suggesting that Canada carbon pricing doesn't work. In fact, the guy who won a Nobel Prize says we're getting it right.
Lots of questions there, but if I could start with the first point that you made. So when I talked about avoided emissions, those emissions in looking at the impact of various measures, including carbon pricing on avoided emissions, yes, it's also essential to account for increased population, increased economic output, all of which has occurred over the past 10 years. And at the same time, absolute emissions have reduced. So emissions per unit of economic production, emissions per capita have declined significantly.
And is it fair to say by a lot more than 3%?
Yeah, yes, and thank you again for that clarification. And on your point, I think I'd just echo what on your last point, I think I'd echo what the minister said, that the government has taken an approach which involves the use of a wide range of measures. But so it is not saying that the sole way to reduce emissions is to impose a carbon price, but it is saying that that needs to be a foundation, and indeed that is an economic consensus, that there is no more efficient way. In other words, there is no cheaper way per ton to reduce emissions and drive innovation, which is essential to enabling increased economic output at the same time.
Thank you. No, I don't want to take William Nordhaus's opinion at just like face value, given that he's a world-leading economist. But would you say that on the world stage, are countries like Canada, in our sort of category of countries, are there more that are joining this trend of pricing pollution and finding economic mechanisms and instruments, monetary-based instruments, to lower emissions? Because it seems as though every time I open like The Guardian or international news, it seems as though other countries are lowering their emissions. And it also seems like some of our best trading partners are insisting that their trading partners do the same thing. Is that an accurate representation?
That's absolutely an accurate representation. And as you know, Canada has been at the forefront of the global carbon pricing challenge. And that's an initiative that has been that we're leading to share information with other countries to enable them to implement carbon pricing. And the interest globally has been.
We have to stop there. Mr. Trudel, the floor is yours. Thank you, Chair. It's unfortunate that I wasn't able to answer my question when the minister was here earlier. We talk a lot about solutions, carbon pricing. The articles that I cited earlier say that we're not able, we think we're going to be able to reduce emissions in the future, but for the time being, we're not getting results. So, and not only that, but we keep going in the direction of producing more and more oil. So I wanted to ask a question about Baie du Nord to the minister. How a company or a country hasn't been able to, how come we haven't been able to reduce our emissions, and how can this country get involved in something like the Trans Mountain Link? there could be spills that could be very dangerous to the environment. And the Baie du Nord project that could generate 116 million tons of emissions. And I don't know about you as officials, you know, this is a progressive government that says it wants to act. They develop a carbon pricing system to try to achieve results, but at the same time, they continue to encourage the oil and gas sector. We're talking about 116 million tons of emissions that we're going to have to remove. We're putting a lot of money into emissions reduction measures, but then we're continuing to encourage an industry that produces emissions. So, did you participate in the deliberations that took place, and did you say yes or no to the Baie du Nord project?
So I'll note a few things in response. I think it's as the minister indicated, in terms of support for the oil and gas sector, the government is moving forward and moving forward really ahead of the pack in terms of the elimination of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies on a go-forward basis. And then, you know, if you layer on top of that the cap on oil and gas emissions, these are clearly you know, efforts to ensure that the oil and gas does not pose an existential threat to the ability to achieve our climate change targets.
Okay, well, that was a short answer. My next question is, when we're looking at zero emissions by 2050, did you take into account the Baie du Nord project emissions in your projections?
So the oil and gas cap was designed, and as the minister said, we're still only at the regulatory framework stage of that, but it is designed to take into consideration the expected emissions with the sector, and it is designed very much to as be an impediment to actual greenhouse gas emissions as opposed to production levels. But John, if you want to add anything on the cap, please go ahead.
I think that the key point around the cap is that it is a cap on emissions, and in the framework document that the government put out, it acknowledged that there will continue to be for some time global demand for oil and gas, and so it's the role of climate policy to ensure that any such production that we can control, in other words, production in Canada, is done in a way that yields increasingly lower emissions over time, leading to net zero by 2050. And that's what the cap will be designed to do.
Even if it's not the case right now. You know, I saw that the oil and gas sector share has increased by over 20% in recent years. So we're getting involved in projects that will produce more oil. So we don't seem to be able to put a leash on the oil and gas sector. And now we're getting involved in other projects that are going to be producing more emissions. How are we going to reach our target for 2050?
So again, I think the answer is through the mix of measures that the government already has in place and is putting in place. The carbon pricing is already driving investments in the oil and gas sector to reduce the carbon intensity of production. The various incentive programs, including the Net Zero Accelerator that the minister spoke about earlier, is providing financial support for major decarbonization projects. And the forthcoming oil and gas cap will ensure that absolute emissions from the sector are reduced over time in a predictable manner.
Right. Another question. Now, in the projections that you're doing for the oil and gas sector in the coming years. They're ambitious with regard to the past, but with regard to what's happening with the technologies, like so carbon stocking, which has not been proven. You're beyond your 6 minutes, unfortunately, by a great deal. In fact, Ms. Collins, the floor is now yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask again a bit about the Environment Commissioner's audit in 2022. He recommended, and I'm quoting, to improve the effectiveness of carbon pricing and the stringency of provincial or territorial large emitter programs, ECCC should assess on the basis of federal modeling whether each provincial or territorial system is sufficiently stringent in that it would be expected to lead to reductions that correspond at minimum to the projected emissions reductions that would result from the application of the federal backstop system, and report publicly on the results of their analysis. Has this happened?
Yes, it has.
And what was the outcome? Are all of the provincial and territorial large emitter systems equal to the federal backstop?
So 2 things happened. First, the first thing we did is we assessed the systems as they were in place in 2021, 2022. Second, we changed the standard. And then third, we ensured that provinces changed their systems. And every province has changed their system since the Commissioner's report.
And they've changed their systems, but the question was really, is each provincial and territorial system sufficiently stringent that it would be expected to lead to reductions that correspond at a minimum to the federal backstop? And
yes,
is that's the case for every single province and territory?
That is the core of the test in the federal benchmark, and every province that has an industrial system has met that test.
Is there in the federal back system, because we know that Suncor pays 1/14 of the carbon price, that the recent Climate Institute report said that this could be strengthened, and especially when it comes to the provincial and territorial large emitter systems, that closing some of those loopholes could get us deeper emissions reduction. Is that your understanding as well, that there's deeper emissions possible if we were to have more stringency and close some of those loopholes?
I'm going to sound a bit like the minister and take and quibble with the term loopholes. But the output-based pricing systems. Well, first of all, Suncor is not subject to the federal system. It's subject primarily to the Alberta system, and
that's precisely the point.
But their system has been significantly strengthened, and achieves what would be accomplished if the federal system was in place. It's important to understand that output-based pricing systems are specifically designed not to impose the full carbon price on emissions in order to enable emissions-intensive, trade-exposed sectors to continue to compete globally in sectors such as oil and gas, steel, cement, chemicals, where many of their competitors do not pay a carbon price at all.
Absolutely. And I guess the Climate Institute, the authors of that report, we're talking about maintaining, the economic viability of these carbon pricing systems on large emitters while still strengthening them to get deeper emissions. And so I'm curious, the minister mentioned that there's an analysis happening right now for industrial carbon pricing. Are you currently looking at strengthening or leading to greater stringency for the federal backstop and for the provincial and territorial systems?
When we updated the federal benchmark, the government committed to conduct a review of carbon pricing throughout Canada by 2026, and that process has started. We've engaged third parties. We're working with Indigenous communities, and we're also undertaking some of our own analysis. And the goal there will be to look at to compare pricing systems across Canada, to look at their effectiveness now, and also to look at the long-term effectiveness, like the expected long-term effectiveness of carbon pricing, and that will then be used to inform decisions by the government of the day about the future of carbon pricing.
I noticed you shaking your head when I was asking the minister a question around the emissions cap, and I guess I want to ask you the same question because I'm just going to read you a quick headline from the Globe and Mail from December 7th. Canada proposes minimum 20 to 23% emissions cut from oil and gas sector. Industry to pay for additional offsets. Can you clarify when the minister said no, that 20% was not the right number? Why is the Globe and Mail reporting something different?
Well, I think the main point the minister was making is that we don't have any regulations out to comment on.
And I was specifically asking about those kind of draft proposals.
It was a framework, and your reference was to offsets. The framework proposes to have a maximum use of offsets of 10%, not 20%.
And I guess I had said that given that it's a 10% minus the 30% standard, that gets us to a 20%, right? If you have an offset that reduces you by 10% and you're asking them only to meet a target of 30-something%, then doesn't that, the Canada proposes minimum 20 to 23 emissions cut from oil and gas sector, isn't that correct?
Sorry, no, it's 10% of the compliance obligation, so it would be 10% of the 30%, so it would be 3%.
Okay, thank you. We'll stop there. That's an interesting question, though. Thank you for that question, Ms. Collins. We'll go to our second round, the 5-minute round, and Mr. Leslie leading off for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to pick up where my colleague, MP Cram, had finished. I'd like to clarify some of the numbers you said. So in 2005, our reference year, it was 19, we've had a reduction of 19 megatons in the 2022 reporting down to 708. That's correct? So from there, you're saying that 30% of that reduction is coming from the carbon taxation policies, but only actually 1% of the overall 3% that we've reduced from 2005 levels is the 30%. But that is, as Mr. Jimenez said previously, based on the assumption of the projection of $170 a ton. So we're actually at half of that based on the price of pollution or the carbon tax being half of that right now. So we are actually at 0.5% of the reduction that we've seen of the 3% is from the carbon tax. And then further, I suppose, if we're going to delineate between the consumer-facing carbon tax, which is apparently, according to the Institute here, only 8 to 14%, the output-based pricing, we're actually at a much, of the total of 3% reductions, we are well under 1% that you can actually attribute to the carbon tax, the front-facing consumer carbon tax.
I think you're confusing some numbers. Well, I know you're confusing.
I just to know, I'll make the base. So when we're talking about the 1/3, we're talking about the combination of the carbon price and the OVPS system, and so if just to go through the individual numbers themselves. So if you took our reference case in 2022, we would go from emissions in 2020 from 674 megatons in 2020 to 641 megatons in 2030. In the absence of carbon pricing, we'd be going from 691 megatons to 720 megatons. And so when you look at that number of the 641 versus the 720, that is how we get to 79 megatons in reductions. And again, that's both the carbon price and the output-based price.
Appreciate that. The purpose of this meeting, the purpose of the minister coming here, is because this committee asked for the totality of the economic and emissions analysis. We're told it is EC Pro, it exists. I imagine it's on a USB, it doesn't need to be a web interface. I'm sure the committee can come for a tour. Can you honestly tell me that if the minister seems okay with it, are you content in the department with this information that has been requested and the totality of these documents being a complete analysis as per the text of the motions, the 3 motions?
So I think what we have provided is all the assumptions that go into the model. So, you know, everything that's assumed in terms of what measures are being put in place and or are already in place or are going to be put in place, and a comprehensive list of that from the federal and provincial governments. We have included a description of how the modeling is done, the idea of introducing a carbon tax into the model and then removing it again to determine the actual impact of the carbon price. You know, as we've indicated, it's within that there's a huge amount of modeling detail that operates. But I think what we're trying to say is I think we've tried to show here's all the assumptions that the model makes, and here's how you can make a determination of modeled price reductions. But Derek, please feel free to add.
No, I think that's right. So like what you need for the modeling is the code. You need the custom software and like a strong enough computer to run it. So
Canada outside of ECCC have that?
they use CGE models, but they don't use EC Pro model. That's a model that's specific.
Is it proprietary? Because I recall wanting to be open by default. Why could somebody that has all of those conditions necessary not use the software and review the modeling? Why does it need to be completely contained? And have you brought in anybody else to use the specific model that you use? To consider other assumptions? You mentioned that there's basically two models, a with or without. We have a carbon tax or we don't. I imagine there's a lot of nuances to whether or not the effectiveness of that carbon tax based on market and economic considerations. I understand a whole bunch of variables. Why can't somebody else go and play with that?
So Derek, it might be useful, I think, if you spoke a little bit to the peer review modeling the peer review of the model and its operation that we actually have done to date and do continue to do. So it's not really just a matter of Environment Canada's modelers determining that this is a good model, that there is an ongoing process of peer review. And you might want to speak to that a bit, Derek.
We're out of time, but I think I was going to ask you that question. I was going to ask you if it was peer reviewed, and you're saying that it is.
Yes, we have had some peer review in the past through academic journals.
Okay.
We also have a process that was started in the ERP, where we're working with other Canadian modelers to share data and assumptions.
Okay.
We've had a couple of meetings with them. We have another meeting in 2 weeks.
That's an important point. Okay, we have to stop there and go to Mr. Ali.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Getting back to modeling and size of the computer, could you please give us an idea of the size of the model? For example, could I load it and run it to my laptop or desktop computer?
No, you couldn't. You'd need a tower computer.
So that's what I thought.
I'm not an IT specialist, though, just to say.
Which means that the size of that file, that's huge, that it could not be uploaded to laptop or the computer. And that's what Mr. Hansen meant, that you have to bring it to...
Again, I'm not an expert on computing power, but if you could get it onto your laptop, you'd still have to know how to write and read the code and understand the software language that the model operates in. So it's a very specialized. We have a bunch of different models in the department. I have maybe 2 or 3 people who can run this model after 6 to 18 months of training. These are econometricians that we hire right out of graduate schools.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the clarifying this model and size situation. I think the rest of the time, my colleague, Sophie Chantal, would ask further questions, please.
Thank you. Thank you to my colleague and thank you to Chair. I want to come back to the same line of questioning that I was asking the Minister. We had some good conversations in this committee regarding the use of carbon pricing as a tool to reduce our emissions. Now, if we just depended on technology, and I'm curious, I did a bit of research. I read a few international reports that were quite interesting, the OECD, for example, and they're looking at what Canada needs to invest in technology to meet its objectives. And by investing in, what we're talking about, $30 to $60 billion a year, so we would triple the debt of Canada. If we didn't use carbon pricing, if we invested in technology, we would triple the Canadian deficit. So what money are they going to be raising taxes to pay for that? Are they going to be taxing families? I don't know how they would get that money, but this is one way. So did your department, before choosing the method that most of the big economies in the world are using, it's a model that relies on market forces. It doesn't cost anything to taxpayers. It reimburses them the cost or the money collected. Did you look at this investment, or did you look at the option of just investing in technology and tripling the deficit rather than just letting the market do its job?
So I'll turn to my colleagues a bit, because they were in the department at the time these decisions, some of this thinking was going. But I would note that policy is actually ultimately based on recognizing there's really not just one tool that you would use. The value of the carbon prices, it sends a market signal, and it finds efficient ways to invest in those technologies and creates an incentive for private sector investment in those technologies, and therefore they're ultimately beneficiaries of those technologies and pay for them. But that and a combination of spending that we did to drive individual consumer behavior. So, for example, the ZEV vehicle incentive. The problem with the challenge on zero emission vehicles is that total cost of ownership, it's a good deal, but there's upfront sticker shock for people to move to a zero emission vehicles because of the price spread between them and an internal combustion engine. So that's an example where we said, well, there was some sense in actually spending money, because it encouraged consumer behavior that they would not otherwise have taken based on just existing market conditions. So certainly not an either or of pricing versus spending on technology, but kind of a combination of the two, so they're reinforcing of one another. And John, you should feel free to add.
Well, that's exactly right. We need to continue to emphasize that the current policy involves a mix of measures. And I would just like to identify or point to one.
Sorry, Mr. Moffat, our time is up, but we have to take a small break because we're changing interpreter teams. So for 5 minutes, we're going to break. Sorry to cut you off, but we're over the 5 minutes. We'll just break for 5 minutes. We're going to change teams, and we'll continue with Mr. Trudel, Ms. Collins, Mr. Mazur, and Mr. Ali again, I think. Okay. Okay, we can get started again. Before we start, I'll just mention, as a matter of housekeeping, I guess, that we have the CEOs of 5 oil companies coming to committee on June 6th. This was based on a motion by Ms. Collins, and we have 4 CEOs, and you'll recall at the last meeting I said the CEO from Enbridge couldn't come because of a meeting. It was Enbridge, right? Mm-hmm. And we agreed that they could send someone else, so they're sending the executive vice president and president. It's one person of gas distribution and storage. Her name is Michelle Harren-Dents. So I thought I would let you know about that. Okay. Apparently, Mr. Trudel is giving his 2.5 minutes to Ms. May. So, Ms. May, the floor is yours.
Monsieur Trudel, pour votre...
Thank you, Mr. Trudel, for your generosity.
I want to try to ask officials about sensitivity analyses that have been done in terms of, as Monsieur Trudel raised quite appropriately, the impacts of things like Baie du Nord. Le ministre a donné son appui pour le projet Baie du Nord. I'm looking at what increases in greenhouse gases we can see when we speak of unprecedented investments by this government, the $34 billion to Trans Mountain expansion comes to mind, and the question of what level of greenhouse gas increased emissions we'll see as a result of the Trans Mountain pipeline. I wanted to ask officials if they had examined the price sensitivity analysis and the relation between building a pipeline when oil prices are generally low and how they increase emissions. The most detailed report I've seen on that was the U.S. State Department environmental assessment on the Keystone Pipeline. And I wonder if any of the officials here had examined that and then looked at what kind of emissions increases we would see with the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
You have 1 minute.
I'll start. I mean, I think it's important to know just up front that the decisions related to the Trans Mountain Pipeline were not necessarily made within our department, so we might not have been doing that kind of analysis. But I'll turn to Derek if you want to add anything.
No, I don't have anything to add. Our projections are based on the Canada Energy Regulator price and production forecasts, so we don't have specific projects per se at least from our macro level projections.
My concern is that in this conversation, we quite often dive into details and weeds that don't make sense to Canadians. In 1990, our greenhouse gas emissions were 608 megatons, bringing it back up to easy levels for people to compare. And in 2022, they were up to 708 megatons, whereas virtually every one of our partners that signed the Kyoto Protocol, particularly the European Union as an example, were far below their 1990 levels. We're one of the only countries that remained above 1990 levels. And based on anything one can find in the literature, building additional fossil fuel infrastructure will increase emissions. The International Energy Agency says so. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says so. So putting public money into building the Trans Mountain expansion, particularly when, this is the point about the U.S. State Department analysis, particularly when the price of Western Texas Intermediate is low, will actually increase emissions.
We're done.
Oh, that's it. Oh,
sorry.
I thought we had 2.5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Well, yes, you got more than that, but it's always very interesting. I wish I could give you more time, but
doesn't know. So.
Yeah. Okay, Ms. Collins.
Well, I'd like to offer Elizabeth the opportunity to finish her sentence.
Thanks so much, Ms. Collins. To any of the officials, do you know if any branch of the Government of Canada examined the impact on our total greenhouse gas emissions in building the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion?
I can't speak personally to whether that was done, but that doesn't mean it's not the case.
Could you follow up with us, with the committee, and let us know any modeling that specifically includes the Trans Mountain Pipeline as well as Beta Nord? It'd be interesting to know, and it would be surprising if the government isn't tracking the emissions increases from the projects that are being approved. And then to Mr. Moffat, I just wanted to follow up on some of what you were saying. Just when it comes to the 20% that we're talking about, in particular that, I'm just going to read a quote here. The federal government significantly lowered its expectations for the direct emissions cuts it will demand from the oil and gas sector by 2030, but it will require the industry to pay for reductions in other areas of the Canadian economy to make up the difference. In a policy framework for a long-awaited oil and gas emissions cap released Thursday, the minority Liberals proposed two-pronged approach to reduce the pollution from Canada's largest emitting sector, while Ottawa believes the fossil fuel industry can reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 20 to 23% through technological changes. It'll impose additional payments for offsets and a new decarbonization fund in order to bring total emissions between 35 and 38%. So that 20 to 23, the government is saying that it's about half of what we're asking our overall target, which is 40 to 45%. Is that correct?
Minutes. It's almost up. You've got 30 seconds.
Okay, sorry,
I've got Liberals on my right here holding me to account. So
I think you're quoting the Globe and Mail, which is interpreting the regulatory framework. I mean, we'd be happy to share the regulatory framework, but it has some proposed numbers in it. The final numbers will be. We're going to provide some updated numbers this fall when we publish the draft regulations for the oil and gas cap.
The draft ones were proposing 20%.
The time's up. So we'll go to Mr. Mazier now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Muntz, has the department ever conducted an emission projection using a scenario where the carbon tax was higher than $170 a ton?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay. Does the department emission model show the government can meet their 2050 emission targets without raising the carbon tax over $170 a ton?
Sorry, did you say, what year did you say
50.
2050? 2050 is our net zero commitment.
So does the price go over $170 a ton to get that target?
I think the minister answered questions, I think, about the future of the carbon price post-2030. But John, I can turn it to you.
That's correct. The government hasn't, neither the department nor the government has had any kind of formal discussion about possible increases to the carbon price. The 2050 target is a formal target. The government's emission reduction plan doesn't have a prescriptive pathway to achieve all of those reductions. It very clearly says that the current plan is a plan to move the economy in the direction of and to start taking some of the early actions needed to get to 2050. It doesn't include all of the measures needed.
So it doesn't include a carbon price? Like, to do those projections, you have to have, it's based off a carbon price.
Any projections out to 2050. We have a target out to 2050.
Well, you have a projection to hit net zero by 2050.
We don't have a projection, we have a target.
Well, did Environment Canada ever provide Nervaeus Consulting or research access to their emissions model EC Pro?
We work closely with the Canadian Climate Institute, who use the Navius model. We also, it's a small community in Canada of modeling. As I said, we've started up a multi-modeling forum to share models and data. But most of the data that Navius would get for their modeling would be from sources that we would use, the National Inventory Report or Statistics Canada data.
So they had access to EC Pro?
Though they have their own CGE model that they use. We talk to them. They can see our, like...
The EC Pro, though, model?
Yeah, they know how the EC Pro works, yeah.
Okay, and they would be able to work with it. Okay.
Yeah, and the model is based on CCI, comparable in terms of results, whether they're looking at individual policies or overall progress. So really the two models they're from the same family, computable general equilibrium models. They're just customized in different ways for different organizations.
Who would okay that?
Who would okay what?
Them having access to EC Pro.
Well, they don't want access to EC Pro. They have their own model.
You just said they would have access to it, so who would okay that?
They would. Who would okay?
Who would say, here's the EC Pro model that we've been asking for here at the committee?
Oh, well, we would share.
Who would give them that access?
We have the document that we shared with the committee that outlines, that's our best evergreen documentation of the model. That's what we give academics, and we would give Navius if they wanted to know, like, the latest state of our model.
Okay. Do Canadian hospitals pay a carbon tax on their energy bills?
Over to you, John.
Pardon? I'd ask the officials.
We, I'm going to have to get, well, I'm going to...
Simple question. Do Canadian hospitals pay a carbon tax on their energy bills? Say if they're using natural gas to heat their hospital, would they be paying a carbon tax?
Specific arrangements for institutions such as hospitals, and I'm happy to provide the committee with a written description of those arrangements.
So would those arrangements include, is the carbon tax fully refunded back to Canadian hospitals?
We can return to the committee with fuller details on that.
So, okay, thank you, and I think that's pretty close, eh?
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Ali, you're going clean up here today.
Thank you, Chair. It's fascinating to see how my colleague from Conservative confusing the situation. The price on pollution, he's trying to give that word tag, carbon tax, or how in interrogation style asking question from our officials. I think we should treat them with respect. Agreed. And not to put our words in their mouth. So I think it's so I'll ask again. Thank you for the official for being here. So as you know, Canada's 2024 National Inventory Report, which tracks all greenhouse gas pollutants, estimated that emissions were 708 megatons in 2022. Outside of the years during the pandemic period, where emissions were artificially low, when was the last time that Canada's emissions were below this current level, and what role has carbon pollution played in getting to this level? Anyone can answer.
I do not have right in front of me the backward years for the NIR. I will know one of the things that happens on the NIR is the historical numbers do get revised after the fact, and I know that sounds counterintuitive, like how can the past change? But the reality is because methodologies and UNFCCC approaches change, sometimes the numbers do get revised upwards. So in some ways, it's a bit of a that could distort that answer a bit, but we can certainly provide the year-over-year changes in the NIR. In terms of the actual numbers this year, I think there's probably a couple things to note that are important. One is you can now see for the first time really ever that there's been a decoupling from our emissions reduction and our GDP growth. It used to be that you couldn't grow the economy without growing emissions. That trend has broken down, and I would also note that that in terms of our post kind of COVID rebound of what we expected in terms of emissions, it is much lower than we had originally projected. Thank you.
So in Canada's next interim emissions reduction objective is to be 20% below 2005 levels by 2026. Does the latest national inventory reports show progress towards this goal? Are we on track to meet it? And how significant is the role that price on pollution is playing to get us there?
Thanks for the question. So yes, we are on track for the 2026 target, and that would constitute the first time one of these targets has been met. In terms of that individual year, I don't know, Derek, if you have that handy or not.
For 2026? Yeah, we're on our latest projections published in December of 2023 show that we're on track to meet that interim objective.
Roughly what percentage of Canada's emissions reduction efforts by 2030 are attributable to pollution pricing system across Canada?
We have it in a range of 31 to 36%, and the range is a result of whether or not you count land use changes in forestries as part of the calculation.
And approximately what percentage of one farm emissions does carbon pollution pricing apply to? And for emissions that carbon pricing applies to, what rebates are available to offset costs while preserving the price signal from pollution pricing to incentive emissions reduction efforts? Yeah, on-farm fuels. Sorry, just to correct that.
On-farm fuels?
Yes.
So there's an exemption for the carbon tax for the fossil fuels used in farm operations, and then John can correct me if I have this wrong, but I think there's also a refundable tax credit for the fuels that might be used for
Point of order.
crops and so forth.
That's false. Like, please define farm fuels. Are you talking about what's going in a tractor? Are you talking about grain?
That is not a point of order.
It's not a point of order. It's not a point of order. But I mean, feel free to answer the question.
Farm fuels are?
Okay, it's not a point of order. We got to continue. We're near the end of the. We've got like about 40 seconds. So I don't know who's answering the question there. Who is answering Mr. Ali's question? Hansen, Mr. Hansen. Go ahead.
Can you repeat the first part of your question again? And I should note, by the way, and it's the other. I think we're talking about in terms of the fuels I was referring to. It's gasoline and it's the light fuel oil, or it's also known diesel.
So what percentage of on-farm fuel emission does carbon pollution pricing applies to?
I'm sorry, I don't have that number in front of me.
I think we'll have to follow up with that number.
That's.
Can you send that to the committee? I guess.
It's fascinating to see that how Mr. Mazur from Conservative interrupted official who responding to my question confuses the situation. And
false.
That's what the Conservative are doing to confuse Canadians. And officials were responding to my question, and he